session is on climate change and disaster response financing. Chairing this session is Dr. Dan Orcherton, hopefully I pronounced that right. He's the director for the Center for Sustainable Technology and Development at FNU. I won't read the entire bio, but you can always find it in the session handout. So I'll give the floor to Dr. Orcherton.
Good afternoon. Again, I hope you all had a great lunch. Briefly, I will outline our next presenter, our first presenter, sorry. His name is Johannes Wolff. I hope I pronounced that right, Johannes Wolff. He's an economist and public finance officer with ADB, Asian Development Bank. And Johan comes to us with a background in economy, public finance, and with an urban social development, public finance, and public management sector focus. He joined ADB in January 2014. He focuses on policy-based leading, budget support, technical assistance in economics, and public financial management. Prior to joining ADB, he worked in the public financial market sector and local governance, the United Nations, GIZ, Sub-Saharan African region. And Johan comes to us with a master's degree in economics from the University of Antwerp in Germany, and a postgraduate diploma in financial management from the University of London, UK. Let's give a warm welcome for Johan, and his topic is entitled Regional Approaches to Disaster Risk Financing in the Pacific.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and it's good to be here. Maybe to start with, this topic is relatively new to me, so I hope I make sense. I also hope I don't use too much of ADB or multilateral development bank financing and wording and concepts, so if yes, then just please ask directly. I'll briefly talk. I try to stay within 15 minutes, even though it seems unrealistic, but about regional approaches to disaster risk financing in the Pacific. So the Pacific is extremely prone to natural disasters. Their annual cost of about $300 million US, so huge amounts. We had examples in the last years. Cyclone Pam, $450 million US, Cyclone Winston, 1.4 billion. So we are really talking about huge amounts of damages and losses. And this is just likely going to increase with the climate change. So based on that, the motivation for looking into disaster risk financing is the elevated and increasing exposure that I mentioned, both to natural hazards like cyclones as well as to climate change. The losses and damages in the end push down growth trajectories. There are studies that, for example, a 90% percentile event undoes like 3.7 years of development and so on. So there are different estimations showing this push down of growth trajectories and in the end affecting development outcomes. And administratively, it also diverts a lot of capacity away from countries and partners. So we at ADB, we need to process more disaster response projects, but also governments. So time is not being spent on the actual planned activities to advance development, but rather to just undo the damages. So in that context, an effective and efficient disaster risk reduction, disaster risk management, as well as the response are critical. Now, looking at the risk finance or the disaster risk financing landscape in the Pacific, gaps are around quick dispersing finance for the transition between the humanitarian response that is largely covered by budget funds and bilaterals, including military intervention, from Australia, New Zealand, France, US, and the different parts of the Pacific. And the longer term reconstruction efforts. So then we start then processing projects after 6 to 9 to 12 months. The bigger projects come online. So in between there is a gap. There are instruments at the moment already available. That's the, for example, ADB's Asia Pacific Disaster Response Facility. That's maybe a couple of million or so for a country in the direct aftermath. Then there's the PCRAFI insurance. It's a joint World Bank, ADB, and other bilateral partners run insurance facility, regional, but these are metric insurances, so they are linked to specific disasters like a cyclone or an earthquake, and they are not covering all kinds of disasters. So for example, slow onset events like droughts are not covered. And also for higher frequency events that don't require significant payouts, they are very expensive for countries. So the premium is very high, and we see that in the current phase of CRAFI that basically the premiums are a lot in comparison to what the end payout in the end is. But as I mentioned before, we still see this significant push down in growth trajectories. So an increasing resources throughout the response phases are also required. So even if ADB and World Bank and other bilaterals and so on have support to the current phases as now, if we could increase that amount, we could get quicker back to the higher growth trajectory and restore development outcomes quicker and focus then quicker to development activities. So based on that, there were some recent assessments done that suggest that contingent credit arrangements or contingent financing arrangements would be a gap. And there was a CRAFI study on advancing disaster risk financing in the Pacific, and ADB has a report that is forthcoming on fiscal burden in the Pacific from natural disasters. And the focus here is on concessional assistance countries that are for us ADF countries, Asian Development Fund countries, and for World Bank, these are the International Development Association countries, IDA countries, because these currently don't have contingent credit arrangements. So for our ordinary capital resource countries, we have theoretically an instrument. The World Bank has catastrophic deferred drawdown options, so CAD DDOs, and we have our policy-based lending instrument that we can use to process contingent credit for these countries. But for the concessional assistant countries, it's not possible, is not available right now. So we are looking into filling that gap. The idea is to complement and build upon or use even existing mechanisms and structures in the Pacific. I will refer back to that as we go along. So we have to, in the detailed design, if there is sufficient interest by countries in this, look into how we can use existing structures. So the main objective of this contingent financing mechanism would be to link the disaster risk reduction and the disaster risk financing bits. So first of all, increase resilience and reduce losses and damages from future disasters, and at the same time, increase effectiveness and efficiency of response. So this is generally how our policy-based operations, development policy operations in the World Bank work. These are budget support operations that are linked to policy triggers. So if you successfully complete certain reforms as agreed, then you have access to financing. So there's kind of the concept of the link. So if you complete certain disaster risk reduction actions, then you are eligible to get financing if a disaster strikes. The idea behind it. Now there is a question that we have internally discussed is whether to go with a contingent credit arrangement or a contingent savings arrangement. A contingent credit arrangement, maybe I can briefly scan forward. A contingent credit arrangement would be that we hold the funds and the country pay out upon a disaster, while a contingent savings would be like it is explained here, that the country applies or agrees on policy-based loan, budget support, and completes the actions, then we pay out the concessional financing to the government. The government then deposits an equivalent amount of their funding into a trust fund or a savings account, and that savings account pays out the share upon disaster, plus interest and whatever is needed. So just as a basic concept, so there's just a slight difference, but we see some advantages from an arrangement as a contingent savings arrangement. First of all, the deposited amounts earn interest for the countries while they are deposited there, and highly likely higher than the interest we charge on our concessional loans. That's, I think, 1% during grace period and 1.5% thereafter. So it should be relatively easily possible to generate higher interest. And for the countries that have to take loans, that don't get full grants, they could theoretically use the principal as repayments if the funding is not used within the grace period. And countries could theoretically also deposit additional resources from the government budget, for example, contingency funds, which shields them from political pressure. So in many countries are issues with maintaining contingency reserves for disasters because of other influence on access, and it would also ensure efficient funds management for the countries, for these funds. And I think the most important point here is ADB internal. This could use our existing policy-based lending instrument. This is the budget support instrument that I explained earlier. So we wouldn't have to create a new instrument for this, which again saves time and makes sense. And it also would avoid ring-fencing of these concessional funds, which we would need to ring-fence in a contingent credit arrangement. And that's basically the reason why the World Bank and ADB don't have contingent credit arrangements for this, because this support from donors, from our shareholders, that the funds they put into our concessional window is meant to be spent within the period and not allocated somewhere and then not used in the end. So in the end, in both points, we would point a bit towards a savings arrangement versus a credit one. Now the other question would be a regional or a country-specific approach for such a facility, and there are a few advantages for a regional one versus a standard country-specific one. A regional facility would generate higher returns because you could reduce the liquidity share in the investment portfolio. So if a country has their own fund, it would have to be 100% liquid to be able to pay out any time. While if you are in a pooled fund, you don't have to keep everything liquid because it's unlike, the chances are very low that the disaster strikes everywhere at the same time. So you generate higher returns, and we would aim at leveraging regional resources, and the regional resources would come on top. So ADB has some country-specific resources, most of them, and then they have a smaller pool of regional resources. And for regional projects, for example, cable projects, like fiber optic cable between two countries, or port or airport projects can access these, or generally regional, like the USP program is a regional loan. So they don't come from country allocation, so country could still use up their country allocation, and we would use a lot of this fund financing coming from a regional pool, which would be in addition for countries. So that would be one advantage, which requires some regional elements to be able to access it, and we internally have to look into that. How we do it with the risk pooling. Is there some element that countries pool their risk together, or are all the allocations earmarked for each country? There could be a pooling of TA and search capacities, for example, post-response, so that countries could second into one team different people that help a country that is affected by disaster. So there could be different thinking around what are actually the regional elements of a facility. And then a regional facility could be more more attractive potentially for bilateral and other sources, bilateral donors from the region, of course, and green climate financing, green climate fund financing, and then I think there is in planning a loss and damages mechanism under the Paris Agreement, VIM. I'm not so familiar with this, but you probably know more. I think it's not yet set up. It's the Warsaw instrument or something. So these could be something that one could top up the pool that countries in the end just take a loan for a certain amount and get matching grants, for example, with that. And it could attract, or it would be good to attach technical assistance, to attract TA resources, and better use existing resources, reducing fragmentation. Instead of having all different country programs, having a regional program has scale effects and is generally more efficient. So in the end, something would look like having a country contribution, having additional grant contributions, bilateral and other sources, and having a technical assistance component. Now this looks quite similar to a crafty second phase multi-donor trust fund arrangement with a technical assistance facility. So like I mentioned, one has to explore what could be actually used that is already existing, and where we would need to build something new. Now, one of the issues with our policy-based loans is that they basically check that policy actions are completed before we pay out. But once we pay out, the incentives to maintain these, and even the resources on our side and government side to actually monitor compliance over time, are significantly reduced compared to before the payout. So the issue here is that, first of all, the policy triggers are probably relatively effective in lifting a country to achieve certain disaster risk reduction or disaster risk management actions, policy actions, but then we would need some incentives to maintain them. So one thing is just kind of a commitment that future support, so additional policy-based grants or loans will only be provided if the last one has been successfully complied with, but that's often a tricky thing, and then governments change and so on, and also there's just a lot of political economy around that. But one could use the additional financial and TA resources that I mentioned, so bilateral donors, other sources, generally to incentivize compliance. And then there is the idea of how to monitor compliance, of something like a seal of compliance or approval. So one doesn't need post-disaster checks. One actually, which are an issue in two things. First of all, it can delay disbursements, because we first need to check if they have complied with it. Okay. And secondly, it's also too late. So when you realize afterwards, you check and know what they haven't complied with, then the whole point of having the DRN policies in place has not helped to reduce losses. So having this continuous monitoring of compliance in place would help with that. It would help probably to establish some kind of understanding of what policies should be achieved in the first hand and what should be the prioritization of policies. And there are likely positive externalities for insurance markets. So countries that are very good, have a very good compliance, could signal that there's lower risk. It would be on fiscal policy, on PFM. So for example, asset management. Right now we are all advocating for asset management. It's very difficult to get traction on that. Well, if it's linked here as a precondition to all this access to significant resources, that could help. Now here just some ideas. So one has a seal there, which has different components. This is just a list that I made up. So there could be a lot of different ones. There are things around fiscal buffers, asset management, planning building codes, PFM systems, so on. And then there could be different, like say a silver and a gold, and different levels of how countries could achieve them. They could be regularly assessed. Countries that need to get an improvement report. they wouldn't immediately lose eligibility to the financing, but instead would have a certain period of time to get their stuff in order. There would be TA to support them, and it would be linked as an incentive to these financing amounts. Now, we do already a lot of regular assessments. The IMF does Article 4 missions, does a lot of the PFM fiscal stuff. Then there is debt sustainability assessment and so on and so forth. So it could be I haven't really thought about what to use, but there's definitely a lot of assessments already going on, so this could be just put in one place. And that's the last slide. So basically, while we are thinking about it, we have to talk to countries, we have to talk internally with ADB, but also with the countries, whether there is interest and the scope of demand for such an instrument, how we build on others, how we leverage regional financing, which would come on top of the country allocations, what the governance arrangements, withdrawal rules, possibly withdrawal rules have to be different for countries' own resources and bilateral resources. Then how we monitor the continued compliance, like for example with the seal, but possibly there are other options. And then about post-disaster implementation capacities. Countries at the moment reallocate a lot of capacity to implement financing. If they get now from one moment to another, a small country gets another 10 million, who is going to implement it? How is going to be the procurement going? How are the technical designs going? And so on and so forth. So there are questions that we would have to look at. And that's it.
That's great. I'd request that all presentations be kept to kind of like 15 minutes if you can. If you can manage that, that'd be great, within reason, of course. And we entertain the questions afterwards. Just make note of the questions you'd like to address the panel when we meet toward the end. And that the questions be kept short and direct. In other words, no long introductions and impromptu personal speeches, things like that. Of course, we'd like to hear from them, but we'd like to keep it to the timing that we have allotted to us. Thank you, Johan. That was very well done. I'll do a summary at the end of this to expedite a little of the presentation so far. Our next presenter is Carola Betzold. She's a postgraduate research fellow at the University of Antwerp in Belgium. Carola comes to us as a visiting fellow at ANU, at the National University and Development Policy Center. Her research focuses on adaptation to climate change, aid, and development, and with particular focus or emphasis on small island developing states. And Carola has a Ph.D. from ETH Zurich. So let's welcome Carola to the speech.
Okay, good afternoon. I think I'll stand in front of this because otherwise you probably won't be able to see me. So my name is Carola Betzold. I'm actually based in Belgium, but currently at ANU, as Dan has said. And I work on adaptation to climate change, particularly in small island developing states and its links to development and development aid. What I do in this presentation, and there's also a full paper that's shortly going to be available, what I do here is to just sort of map out adaptation aid. So aid that has been marked as relevant for adaptation in the Pacific region. So as you can see here, adaptation aid has gone up significantly since 2010. So the OECD collects data on adaptation aid and introduced in 2010 a so-called real market for adaptation. And since then we have actually data for what donors think is relevant for adaptation. And you can see that globally there has been about $35 billion made available for adaptation, and that refers to disbursements. and to what the OECD has reported. So it's not comprehensive, but it's probably the most comprehensive data that there is. Of this global 35 billion in adaptation aid, only a small share goes to the Pacific. It's about 700 million that goes to the Pacific. I should also add that this might sound like a lot of money at first, but if you compare aid for adaptation to aid for mitigation, adaptation is the much smaller part. So let's take a closer look at these 700 million adaptation aid in the Pacific. That's what I want to do here, and I want to do that using the OECD data for the period for which we have data, which is 2010 to 2014. And I want to basically ask three questions, or answer three questions. And the question is, how much adaptation aid has come to the Pacific? Who has been giving this aid, and who has receiving it? And to cut it short, basically, the answers to these questions is that A, there's only a small share of global adaptation aid that has come to the Pacific, as you've seen on the earlier slide. But importantly, the small share is also, the adaptation aid is also a small share of overall development aid that has come into the Pacific region. There's only a few, mostly bilateral donors that have been giving adaptation aid, so notably Australia is kind of the key player here. And if you look at who has received adaptation aid, you can see that the adaptation aid is actually distributed rather unevenly among the Pacific Island countries. And that holds regardless of whether you look at total adaptation aid volumes, or whether you look at per capita flows of adaptation aid, or adaptation aid as a percentage of overall development aid. There's a few more questions that I asked or that I answer in the paper, but I won't have time to go through that today. If you're interested, as I said, the paper is shortly going to be available, and then of course there's also room for questions and comments later. So a note of caution to start with, all these figures are based on the OECD creditor reporting system, which is sort of where a lot of aid data is collected, but it's, as I said, it's not comprehensive. It is though the most comprehensive data that there is at the moment. Following the Copenhagen Pledge made in 2009 to provide 100 billion climate finance per year by 2020, the OECD introduced the so-called Rio marker for adaptation. So since 2010, donors have been required to mark those projects, those aid-funded projects that are relevant for adaptation. And they're required to mark whether a project has adaptation as its principal purpose, so where adaptation is the main goal, or where adaptation is a significant co-benefit, but not the main goal. So as you can see, this relies on donors' own classification, and there's no control. There's also no clear definition of what or how donors should apply this Rio markers. And if you dig a bit deeper, you can see that different donors have slightly different definitions of what counts as adaptation aid. So there's clearly problems with the system of relying on donors' own classification with rather vague reporting guidelines, and there have been criticisms of over-reporting and of mislabeling. And finally, just to clarify, I here refer to disbursements, and this includes both loans and grants. So to be fair, the vast majority of the adaptation aid that has come to the Pacific has come as grants and not as loans. But there is a small part that has come as loans, and then so will need to be paid back. So let's take a closer look at this OECD data. In this graph, you can see the overall development aid as reported in the OECD that has come to the Pacific between 2010 and 2014. You can see this Rio marker for adaptation basically classifies 8 projects into 4 categories. Projects that have been screened but have been deemed irrelevant for adaptation, projects that have not been screened, and then projects which are relevant for adaptation, so where adaptation is either the main purpose, the principal purpose, which is the darker green bars here, or where aid is a significant benefit but not the main goal, that's the lighter green. And as you can see, and as you already saw previously, it's a small share. Adaptation aid is a small share of overall development aid. You can see it's just under 7% actually of the total development aid in that period that has been marked as relevant for adaptation. In 2010, not all the donors have applied the Rio marker, so which is why we see just a tiny share of overall aid that has been marked as relevant for adaptation. In 2011, and this has been a year where the total volume of adaptation aid has been the largest. It's a bit hard to see from that graph, but what you should be able to see, or what you could see if you just look at the green bars, is that since 2011, adaptation has actually declined constantly. And that's of course bad news because the adaptation needs certainly have not gone down in that same period. In the run-up to Paris, there has been some movement, and many of the donors have made pledges to increase their climate finance. So we'll see how this works out and to what extent the Pacific can actually benefit from these pledges made. So the second question is then, who gets that aid that has been provided so far? This is the total adaptation aid. The total adaptation aid flows by recipient. And you can see again, the lighter share is significant adaptation aid, the darker share is principal adaptation aid. The by far largest recipient of adaptation aid in the Pacific has been Oceania as a region, so regional programs. And this is also where the majority of projects actually target adaptation as their principal purpose. What we can also see is that there's a very uneven distribution. Some countries get a lot more, some countries get rather little. Of course, partly this has to do with population size, but if you take that same graph and translate adaptation into adaptation per capita, you see again a very uneven distribution. And then finally, the third question that I had is who's actually giving that aid? So this is the main providers of adaptation aid in the Pacific. The upper graph is the multilateral providers, as reported in the OECD. As I said, it's not comprehensive. The lower part is bilateral actors. So first, you can see that there's a small number of actors that actually gives adaptation aid to the Pacific Island countries. Multilateral funds play a rather small role. It's basically the European Union that gives adaptation aid. There's a little bit of adaptation aid that has come through the Adaptation Fund and through the Climate Investment Funds. But it's rather a small share. Bilateral adaptation aid is much more important, and here Australia is by far the largest provider of adaptation aid. In fact, Australia is the single largest provider of adaptation aid to the Pacific. It accounts for over about 2/3 of bilateral and over 50% of total adaptation aid that has come to the Pacific in that region. What you cannot see from that graph, but what you can see from the data is that Australian adaptation aid has also declined considerably since 2011. So that's also again bad news, but Australia did make a promise to provide continued climate finance in the run-up to Paris. But to what extent the Pacific will benefit from that pledge remains to be seen. The other big neighbors, Japan and New Zealand, also are quite important providers of adaptation aid to the Pacific. Germany is so as well, to a lesser extent. And then there are a few other bilateral donors, including, for instance, the United States. And these other bilateral donors largely give support to regional programs. So they're not necessarily active in the individual countries. They mostly help the regional programs. So this was basically just a snapshot. And I'll stop here. As I said before, there's a full paper. There's more that you can do with the data. And if you're interested, look for the paper. It's going to be available on the Development Policy Center's website. So to conclude this presentation here, this is clearly just the first step, and actually we'll have a second step later in this panel where there's a presentation that looks at actually how we can explain the uneven distribution of adaptation aid across recipients. So why do donors give adaptation aid to specific countries and not others, or not to the same extent to some countries than to others? As I said before, this relies solely on donors' own classification of what parts of their aid is relevant for adaptation. And it's not always clear how or why donors label specific projects as relevant for adaptation. There's only limited information in the OECD data, so sometimes it's just impossible to follow through the decision of donors to mark a specific project as relevant for adaptation. Additionally, there's also the problem that a specific project may have a small adaptation component, but you only see the total cost of that project. So there's also, you have to bear that in mind as well if you look at these figures. But I think, as I said, this is limited and imperfect data, but the best data that there is at the moment. And what you can see, the conclusion that you can draw from that analysis is that A, we do need more adaptation aid. We need to scale up and particularly more predictable adaptation aid. B, we do need to make sure that what is counted as adaptation aid actually is adaptation aid. So we do need clearer definition and reporting guidelines. The Paris Agreement has been a first step in that direction, so that the International Committee has agreed to revise and refine the reporting guidelines and the definitions. So we'll see what comes out of that. And finally, I think just as important is to measure and track adaptation aid actually within the recipient countries. So it's important to look at within recipient countries who is getting that aid, is it those most vulnerable within countries that receive aid, and what do they do actually with the aid? And is the projects that have been funded, do they help the recipients? But I think this is just as important as the need for more predictable support. So with that, I'd like to thank you, and I do look forward to questions and comments in the end. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Carola, very much. It was a very, very good talk, and tells us a little bit more about the importance of aid. And many seminars and conferences I've attended, some of them actually call it aid diction, which is appropriate, I suppose, in some contexts. But a necessary part of what that means is that adaptation to climate change is becoming more and more of a relevant and very important perspective on how we deal with this. Our next speaker is Susana Taua'a. She's the head of the Social Sciences Department at the National University of Samoa. Susana is telling us a little bit about today a practicality of payment for ecosystem services program to project and manage Samoa's watershed areas. It's a very important topic. And Susana is a senior lecturer at the National University of Samoa. She teaches full-time and serves as the head of the Department of Social Sciences, which is encouraging to have more social scientists present in many, many things that we do here. She's studying full-time Ph.D. at the National University of Samoa. And she's the only full-time breadwinner, I guess, in her family, which is really neat. Okay, Susana, hope that's, I pronounced your last name correctly. Thank you.
Okay, this is the topic. I'm going to be very brief given the time constraints. But I'd like to acknowledge the funding agencies, ADB in particular, for giving us the opportunity to share some of the work we're doing, or at least pretend to be doing, think we're doing. I'll begin with the problem. It's very straightforward. We're using water faster, we as in the Samoan people, in nature's ability to produce it for us. A lot of our cultural and social economic activities are also contributing towards the pollution, water mining in the island. And as such, I think we need to compensate nature. So we have laws, we have village bylaws, we have household laws, government policies, but they're not enough, they're not effective. So we need to explore another option in the form of payments for ecosystem services, hence this study. The objectives of the study, by the way, was funded by the European Union. Very straightforward. Asked the question, is it feasible in an island state like Samoa? How can we sell the idea to the public, especially knowing what the mentality of the people, we need to change their way of thinking. what do they think about the idea? And at the same time, I think we need to come up with quantitative evidence to support selling the idea and convincing the people. The methods and processes used to collect the information in the study, a standard academic toolkit of qualitative and quantitative methods, and they're all in the report if you're interested. PES is basically the latest method, I suppose, in climate adaptation tools. It's not new to other parts of the world, Europe and South America, the Caribbean. So there are success stories in the literature from these parts of the world. What is PES? There's various definitions out there of what PES is, as you can see. According to academics, PES is putting a price on unpriced ecosystems. The FAO, they define, look at PES as creating markets for ecosystem services to be traded, etc. But so far in Samoa, we like to think of PES as an equitable and fair means of sharing the cost and the price of water resource protection and production among all users, including the poor. The fundamentals of any PES scheme, should we embark on it, they're very challenging and burdensome. So in order for Samoa to come up with its own version of PES, I think basically we need to contextualize these principles to suit our needs. And if you know, the principles of a PES scheme can be quite challenging, especially with a beneficiary pays. How can we convince and make the poor pay for their water when normally they think that water, or they believe that water is a free gift, a free good from God, so who are we to charge and ask them to pay for something that's supposed to be free? So that's a kind of mentality I think we need to change. There are basically 3 types of PES schemes identified. The government initiatives, private payment schemes, which can be quite costly and difficult for us, considering the issues such as land tenure and ownership. Private schemes, by definition, also are self-organized private deals where beneficiaries downstream make direct payments to ecosystem service providers upstream for the protection and restoration of the watershed services. So we have cases in Samoa of upstream providers, cattle farmers, these are the church and government at the same time, who happen to have their cattle station and farms less than 50 meters from the watershed. So that's a big problem. It's the government and the private landholders, so how do you address that particular problem issue? Some of the challenges were identified from the scoping study. For example, we need functioning urban governance systems. One of the problems we have is we have too many institutions with overlapping and often uncoordinated jurisdictional responsibilities, which prevents effective ecosystem management. Some of the problems identified is funding PES, supposedly aligned with the presentation, the last presentation about critical projects that we need to channel aid funds to. Now the question really is, can it be done? Is it doable? Well, in the last 3 months, we believe we can, it can be done. But we need to address the challenges as identified earlier. The government needs to be committed to the political level. There has to be that political willingness to sell it and push it through, and hopefully it'll cascade down to the consumers. We also need to ask the question, are private businesses, especially the beverage and water companies and the biggest water user, Electric Power Corporation, are they prepared to come on board and engage? The question also is asking the prospective buyers and sellers, is it asking too much? And I think basically it comes down to profit margins versus a long-term conservation of ecosystem services. So those are challenges, I think. And if we address the challenges, then we can answer the question. Water quality testing is an important determinant for water resource-based PES scheme, because it provides the evidence that we need to justify a PES scheme when we take it to the people. So the evidence we could think of is conducting water quality testing. So I'm only giving examples here of some of the water that was tested along one of the main streams, the Watershed. So you can read through, it is very straightforward and it's very polluted. In terms of biochemical oxygen demand, the results from the two sites, as you can see, fairly high, meaning there are lots of organic material and bacteria in the water for the two samples there. So what next? Well, there are all sorts of implications, and I'm sure you're all familiar with them. Most of these impacts are downstream where the majority of the population and businesses exist. So this also justifies a PES scheme for Samoa. We engage focus groups. We actually need to ask the people, especially the poor, see, we need to include them in all the policies and not exclude them when it comes to paying for their water. So from the focus group discussion, we managed to extract some common themes. And first and foremost is the issue of mativa, poverty, hardship, however you define it. It's a very sensitive issue amongst our people because we don't like to see the word poverty or reference to poverty. I don't know why, don't ask me. I think you can come up with your own answers, but we seem to prefer the term hardship. So, and because there's quite a lot of hardship, therefore the poor refuse to pay because, according to them, they're paying too much already with their power, cash power, and their cultural obligations, and putting their children through school. There's also the general unbelief. There is nothing wrong with the environment. There is a lot of water, there's a lot of rain. What are we on about, etc., etc. So that's the kind of thinking that we need to address. But at the same time, they value water. Yes, of course they value water. And where do they place, how much value do they place on water? As you can see, 80% highly value water compared to other basic needs. And the willingness to pay, they're willing to pay. Yes, 55% willing to pay. 44%, they don't want to pay. Others, they will pay if it was required by law. Some people say it's none of my business or anybody's business. Water is a gift from God. And because I'm running out of time, these are just some of they're all in the report if you're interested. The key informants are the small to medium business people, the landowners, the church. The three mainstream churches are the big landowners and the watershed. And it's a very sensitive issue amongst them because the Catholic Church in particular are turning the watershed into a concrete jungle. So that's another issue we need to address at the moment. So I think I'll stop there. You can ask your questions over afternoon tea.
Thank you very much, Susana. That was a wonderful talk. And moving right along, again, if you have any comments, questions, queries, reserved for the end, we'll have plenty of time to hopefully answer some of the questions you have. Our next speaker is Stacy-ann Robinson, and her topic is, I'll just give you a brief background on Stacy. Is an Australian Awards Ph.D. scholar in the Fenner School of the Environment and the Society of Australian National University, and actually over morning tea I discussed a little bit of the Fenner School, which is quite an influential school in ANU, and her work seems very important for most of the things we're doing here. Her thesis focuses on climate change adaptation in small island developing states. She's currently a rostered adaptation and financing consultant for the Caribbean, for the Commonwealth Secretariat of the Caribbean, and the Community Climate Change Center there. Her topic is international financing for climate change adaptation in small island developing states. Let's give a warm welcome for Stacy.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Stacy-ann Robinson, a PhD scholar in the Fenner School. This afternoon, I'll be presenting a paper that was co-produced with Dr. Matthew Dornan in the Crawford School. The presentation outline is as follows. I will give an overview of our research context. I will outline the aims of our paper. I will discuss our research methods, let you know a little bit about the limitations of our study, outline the main findings, some key issues, the conclusions, and acknowledge some very important persons. Small island developing states, or SIDS, are particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. But some amount of climate change is inevitable, and that's why adaptation is so important. However, adaptation is costly, and SIDS have financial and other constraints, and this is why they actively pursue international adaptation financing to help them offset these costs. Our paper explores the experience of SIDS with international adaptation financing, and it has three main aims. One, to identify trends in this financing to 50 small island developing states. Two, to identify the determinants of this financing, and three, to elicit the perspectives of SIDS policymakers on their experience with financing. We use a mixed methods approach, but like Carola, we use the OECD data on official development assistance, or ODA, that is marked as supporting adaptation in SIDS. We do a quantitative analysis of this data, and we conducted semi-structured interviews with 65 senior national and regional climate change officials, both in the Caribbean and the Pacific. Just to give you a little bit more about the nature of the quantitative analysis, we focused on multivariate regression modeling. Our dependent variable was total financing that included both the principal funds and the significant funds that Carola mentioned in her presentation, but this total was between 2010 and 2014. The independent variables that we considered were population, per capita income, vulnerability, governance, aid dependence, colonial status, whether or not a country was located in Africa, and least developed country status. There are some limitations of this study, and Carola really captured a lot of those. But in addition to those, this data only captures commitments and not disbursements. And because it's primarily bilateral data, there may be multilateral donors, such as the World Bank, that are excluded. And of course, this data set is subject to double counting, underreporting, and overreporting. So just to give you an idea of some of the trends, and what I will try to focus on is a comparison across the 3 SIDS regions. So the total financing over the period was almost $2 billion US, and this was roughly 6% of the adaptation funds to all developing countries, and we're talking about 160 countries here. It ranged from a low in 2010 of $143 million US to a high of $520 million US in 2012. Significant financing was generally higher, and this accounted for about 56% of all the commitments, and principal financing for about 44% of the total commitments, and you can have a look at the chart on your right. But it's important to mention that 5 SIDS, and in particular these SIDS are Cape Verde, Dominican Republic, Haiti, Guyana, and Timor, accounted for 51% of the entire financing that was committed to the 50 SIDS that we looked at. By region, funding to the Pacific was generally higher than funding for the other 2 regions. But there are exceptions in 2013 and 2014 as well in terms of the Pacific. But funding to the AIMS region, and AIMS includes the Atlantic, Indian Ocean, Mediterranean, and South China Sea region, and that includes countries such as Cape Verde and Mauritius, was generally lowest except in 2013. But just to mention that this is the smallest region of all the 3 SIDS regions, so that's important to bear in mind. But over the period, the Caribbean accounted for 41% of the total financing, which is equivalent to about $818 million US, and the Pacific accounted for 36%, which was roughly $712 million. But just to indicate as well that when we did this analysis for data that excluded 2014, the Pacific had probably around 46% of the financing. So there are really changes in the trends now that we've included the 2014 data. Now, just to give you an idea of what the Pacific countries have been receiving in terms of the commitments, we looked at 15 Pacific countries, and the highest commitments went to Timor, and that was $138 million, accounting for 19% of the financing. Not far behind is Vanuatu with $132 million over the period. Then the Solomons, $108 million. Samoa, $65 million, and PNG, $62 million. This map highlights the top 10 donors to all SIDS, and I will just focus on the top 5. We have Australia, 18%, France, 18%, the EU institutions, 16%, along with Japan, and Norway, 6%. But it's important to note as well that these 5 donors accounted for 73% of all the committed financing. And when we focus just on the Pacific SIDS, the top 5 donors were Australia, accounting for 48%, Japan 17%, New Zealand 15%, the EU institutions 14%, and Korea 2%. Of interest as well is that these 5 donors accounted for 97% of the financing. So these 5 are pretty much it. In terms of the determinants, in all the models that we ran, the following factors were weak determinants of financing levels: African country status, LDC status, and aid dependence, and we measured this official development assistance over gross national income, but this largely depended on how we measured vulnerability. But what it indicates is that donors don't allocate funding on the basis of past aid or substitute adaptation funding for regular aid. In some models, the following factors were determinants of financing levels: colonial status, when we looked at specific donors, and vulnerability, again, just how we measured it was really critical in the results. In all models, the following factors were strong determinants of financing levels: SID status, and we control for population. Population, which means that the more people that a country has, the more funding it was likely to receive, but only in log form. So the smaller countries got more funding on a per capita basis. And per capita income, I had here poorer countries receive more financing, but as Susana pointed out, poor, it's a bad word, so I will revisit this. But in all models, the strongest determinant was governance, but not in every single case, because you did have a few outliers, and one of those is Timor. But is this a paradox? Well, it's logical in terms of aid effectiveness. Donors want to give monies to countries that are able to manage the monies and able to use them effectively. But the fact is that better governed countries are more likely to have adaptive capacities, and hence why it is potentially a paradox. Now, we also conducted interviews, and I just wanted to give you just an overview of how the opinions fared in terms of the Pacific vis-a-vis the Caribbean. Now, in the Pacific, there is a strong sentiment that climate change is a developed country responsibility, where developed countries should be supporting developing countries. But in the Caribbean, it's a little different. They are of the view that costs should be shared between developed countries and developing countries, and what we should be trying to do is to apportion responsibility based on percentages. In the Pacific, there's a view that Pacific Island countries have a hard time getting funds compared to other groups. Not so much the LDCs, but especially the African countries and other SIDS, especially the Caribbean SIDS. But in the Caribbean, the view is that Caribbean SIDS have a small voice on the international stage, and that they need to learn from the Pacific SIDS, who they believe are able to attract more financing. In the Pacific, there is a consideration that the paperwork just to access these funds is burdensome. And in one of the interviews, a comment by the Tuvalu Prime Minister, I believe, and he said the GCF, the Green Climate Fund paperwork, is higher than the sea level rise in Tuvalu. But in the Caribbean, of interest is that many of the interviewees that we spoke to were not generally au fait with the structure of international financing, and were not able to comment on the structure and the access, which was quite interesting as well. In the Pacific, there's a feeling that the 8% administration fee charged by regional organizations or multilaterals is big money. And instead of paying this over to the regional organizations, they could be using that money to help them better adapt. In the Caribbean, by contrast, there is a feeling that climate change is what one interview called a cash cow, in quotes, and what was previously a disaster risk reduction project has now become a climate change project, because that is what will get them the money. Some key issues. Allocation continues to be skewed, but SIDS do not get less financing than other developing countries, because there's a feeling that SIDS are disadvantaged in terms of their access. Donors do provide more funding to their former colonies. Another key issue is how can we improve access to funding how can we make ourselves ready to access these funds, and whether or not vulnerability or vulnerable countries are being prioritized in their access to climate change adaptation financing. So some conclusions that we're able to draw from this paper is, again, allocation of funds is highly skewed. However, SIDS are not generally disadvantaged in their access to adaptation financing, but one thing to remember is that this data is largely bilateral data, and a lot of the interviewees spoke to access to multilateral funds. African countries and LDCs are not allocated more adaptation financing than other countries, not when other variables are taken into account. Governance has a considerably positive impact on adaptation funds received by SIDS. And while our results contradict some of the commonly held views of policy makers in SIDS, example, which region is able to attract more financing, more research is needed. And we were able to conduct this research through the kind support of the ANU and the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade in Australia. Presentation support for today from the ADB. We spoke to many representatives of SIDS, governments, and regional organizations in the Caribbean and the Pacific, and we consulted quite a few colleagues. They're named there, but just to emphasize that these views expressed in our paper and the presentation do not necessarily reflect the views of the project funders or the colleagues we consulted. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Stacy-ann, that was great. Okay, what I'll do at this time is I'll make a brief summary of the 4 presentations. Initially, we heard from Johannes, who quickly outlined the gaps of the disaster risk and financing, the ADB's role in that. We looked at concessional countries and the and some adjustments in terms of detailed designs, etc., that were put in place through ADB funding, etc. He looked at regional perspectives and country-specific contingency programs in place from a financial perspective. Carola actually did a really good job in terms of outlining the some OCD data, as we heard from Stacy's presentation as well, and that the activities that were undertaken were quite interesting in terms of the development of aid programs. She looked at flows by certain signatories and the regional approaches in Oceania. Carola also outlined briefly the importance of the money that's been allocated so far, how that's filtered into the programs that were in place in terms of real markers, and how that's eventually pans out in terms of its availability over the Pacific region itself. Susan's talk in Samoa briefly outlined the payment for each ecosystem services program, how that filters in with the current situation with water in our country, and the concerns that the local people have about that. Some local initiatives, some pilot schemes, also some public and private cost-sharing programs that are in place. She questioned whether PES is doable, and outlined some positives and negatives in that regard, which I think were very informative. And lastly, Stacy-ann, of course, gave a really good presentation on the aspects of on some of the aspects that outline some of the particulars with respect to her research in the area, and how that reflects on climate change priorities and SIDS. She outlined some numbers, which were very interesting numbers as well, in terms of amounts given into different regional countries to help finance adaptation strategies, etc. So at this time, I'd like to call the members to the panel, which they're all sitting down, so that's okay. And I welcome any questions you have for the panel. Yes.
Thank you to all the presenters. My name is Mahendra Kumar. I work for the Practicability Development Forum. I've got a few questions for different speakers. Maybe I'll just begin with questions for the two speakers, Carola and Stacy, in relation to aid for adaptation. Now, the OECD report, which both of you alluded to, which is $57 billion average available. I'm not sure you're aware, but there's been a lot of critiques of this particular report. And one of the reports done by a group of Indian from the Ministry of Finance, Government of India, actually calculated that the actual amount is actually about 2.7 billion. This figure, hugely exaggerated, of course designed to show that a lot of the money is going to adaptation, where it's subject to all sorts of issues like the definition of climate funds, the definition of new and additional, what actually constitutes adaptation funding, is it over and above overseas development assistance, and so on. So I was very pleased to see that the study on the Oceania by Carola actually began to look at how much actually adaptation accounts for. And as you saw from those bar graphs, the amount is actually very, very minimal. I think by extension, I assume that what the Indian report critiqued, and that was just before Paris, it was widely available to everyone, is probably the same would apply for the Oceania one. In actual fact, the actual amount of adaptation money for the Oceania is actually minute. So I'd like to have your comment. The other thing is in relation to both the speakers, and Stacy in particular, your definition of the Rio markers as a principal objective and significant objective. Now that, again, is hugely self-assessed as what constitutes adaptation being a principal objective, what constitutes it being a significant objective. And again, that plays on the definition and how much money in actual. I think the figures you said, only 15 to 20% of the total money which is available for climate change has come to adaptation. Is probably true. And this is why the SIDS have been asking for a balanced approach in the Paris Agreement. More money for adaptation, which we really haven't seen, and the development partners haven't really quite come to that. Even the $100 billion which has been promised is still, as you know, subject to all sorts of arrangements in terms of how we'll see that and the modalities and so on. So my question is really is whether your analysis is beginning to critique some of these in a much more objective way. And another question to Tracy is when you talk about outliers like Timor-Leste, I'd be interested to know how you should define that. And a related point is you said that LDCs and others don't get a preference, but when you looked at the data, you showed that the 4 main recipients were LDCs in the Pacific. So I just didn't quite sort of understand why is it that your conclusion is that LDCs do not get more of the funds. In actual fact, I think if we look at it, they did actually. And really, it's not a criticism, because they do deserve it because of their status as LDCs, but they do get more funds. So these are some of the issues which I think come out of your papers. I'll be interested to hear your comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Mahendra. Would you want to address those questions, Stacy or Carl?
Thank you, Dr. Kumar. I just want to point out that Matt is also here to help me answer any questions that persons may have, particularly in terms of the regressions. But just to reiterate what Carola said, is that we know that there are a lot of issues with this data, but currently it's the best that we have. And what we presented here today is by no means the final assessment. This is not the be-all and end-all of international adaptation financing to SIDS. There's an opportunity for us to continue the research. So as better information, better data becomes available, there's nothing preventing us from doing these regressions again and updating the knowledge, because that is just how we learn. So in the absence of better data, this is the best information we have at this time. I just want to point out as well that we're very reliant on the donor's information, but what about the recipient's information? There's an opportunity, and this is just a personal view, there's an opportunity for SIDS themselves to collect this data and say, hang on, OECD, although you're telling us that you are giving us this money, this is all we got, and this is all we got for adaptation. So I just want to emphasize that this responsibility is not only on the donor, but can also be on the recipient. And as SIDS, we should try to start collecting this data so we can increase the transparency and the accountability. Just to point out as well that when we said that the LDCs don't generally receive more money, but yet we had LDCs receiving the most money, just to point out that we did all the LDCs across the world. So it's not only the SIDS that are also LDCs, but LDCs that are not SIDS, and that is why. In terms of Timor being an outlier, well, how we measured the governance was using the World Governance Indicators that are published by the World Bank, and we took an average over the 2010, 11, 12, 13, 14, over the 5 years, and we came up with one average governance figure, and that for Timor-Leste was low, but yet still it was revealed from the data that they received the largest commitments in the Pacific SIDS. Now, in terms of the principle of significant financing, we had no choice but to use the OECD's definition, because we are using the OECD data. So it was only logical for us to do that. In terms of how the OECD differentiates between these two sub-markers, if you want to call them that, the principal financing is that this activity would not have been funded otherwise. So they define it as a climate change adaptation activity, because in another scenario, it could not be funded, it would not be classified as that. In terms of the significant financing, what it means is that climate change is a principal objective, but it's not the only principal objective. And what it means as well is that they might have a project, but it has been modified to accommodate climate change concerns. Now, based on that, again, just a personal opinion, is we need to ask ourselves, the projects that we're proposing for funding, to what extent are these projects really adaptation projects? So for example, if you have a project that, say, you're building groins or breakwater structures, is this project an adaptation project, or is it a coastal protection project? Now, I say that to say that as SIDS, we need to be sure what we're doing, we need to be sure of what we're proposing to be done, and we can't expect the donor to know for us.
Just very briefly, as Stacy-ann said, it's clearly not the perfect data, and I think these numbers should be taken with, you should bear in mind that this is donor specification. There are certain problems, so the figures take them with caution. It's also the real market for adaptation has not been introduced to measure climate finance or adaptation finance, and the purpose was to measure mainstreaming of climate change and other activities in a given I think the principal data is probably more reliable. There's less over-reporting there. It's also because if you look at significant adaptation projects, most donors do not account them 100% towards their climate finance goals, but usually about 50%. Although, as I said, it's hard to really follow through the donors' thinking all the time. If there's a project where adaptation is just a small part, but it is a part, they might account it for 50%, even if in practice the adaptation component is maybe 10% or even only 5% of the project. But as Stacy-ann said, there's just no best data for the time being. But hopefully out of the Paris Agreement and the agreements to work on definitions and reporting guidelines, we will get better data in the future.
Okay, a couple of hands went up. Guy in the center, Mick, I believe. Go ahead.
Thank you for your presentations. You've made a point that the amount of financing that's available for climate adaptation projects in the Pacific is only $700 billion, presumably not enough. You also pointed out that different donors have different ideas of what adaptation means. You pointed out that some countries prefer to give funds to particular countries because they were previous colonies or what have you. Pointed out that the quality of applications may vary because application requirements in some cases at least are very complex. Presumably as well, if there's only $700 million available, donors have to go through some kind of rationing exercise in determining who gets what money and who doesn't get money, which inevitably is going to be somewhat arbitrary. My question is, what can we do to make sure that we get an optimal allocation of the limited amount of money that is available? I think that's as important as increasing the amount of money that we do have.
Yes. Go ahead. You can respond to that.
Thanks first for the good summary of the presentations. I think the optimal allocation is to look at where is the money spent as wisely as we can. So I think it's very important to look at what kind of aid-funded adaptation projects have worked, which have not worked, and why, and then communicate that information to prevent the same mistakes happening again and again, and actually try to learn from these mistakes and to copy those of the best practices in terms of what has worked and what has not worked.
Thank you for the question. Well, one of the results that we have is that governance plays a significant role in terms of attracting financing. So, not that I have the answer specifically on how to improve governance, but what I will say, and this is the example I give all the time, if I had $100 million and I wanted to give it to somebody, I want to give it to somebody that at least has a bank account. So we can improve our systems locally to demonstrate our ability to better manage the funds that we get. So that's the first thing. But specifically, how to make that happen on a broader governance level, I'm not sure. But one thing Carola just said is that we can have a good track record, essentially, in managing these funds. And this is one thing that an interviewee mentioned in the interviews that Matt and I did, is that they were questioning the extent to which previous mismanagement of funds impacted on their ability to attract future funds. I can't say definitively whether that is taken into consideration, whether officially or unofficially, but I think it's something to bear in mind. The third thing is that I think, and personal opinion again, that there are a number of soft factors that we were not able to capture in these regressions. And I think this has a lot to do with person-to-person relationship. And there was a feeling in the Pacific interviews that there are definitely some Pacific countries that are able to attract more financing, and they mentioned Fiji as one and Samoa. And I remember speaking to a diplomat, and the observation was that when you go to these international meetings, the Fijian diplomats, the Samoan diplomats are all over the place, conducting meetings in the margins, doing what they need to do to get that money. And I remember in one of my interviews as well, the interviewee said, you know, in Samoa, we don't wait on the money to come to us. We swim out after it.
Girl, Senator, please. Sorry.
Stacy-ann from the Cook Islands. Thank you for your presentation. Just a couple of comments, I suppose. Carola, you showed in your graph that most of the funding...
sorry, I just can't hear you. Thank you.
Yeah, most of the funding was going to regional or Oceania, and that was quite a significant pool. It would be good to see that then spread again and seeing where it's actually going. And just commenting on that with the GCF coming out and the scramble for funds, in the Cook Islands, we're seeing regional agencies run after those funds for regional programs that then we have to buy into, which is another level of bureaucracy, dare I say. Although we appreciate the help from regional agencies, I think you do need to concentrate on that pool and see exactly where it's going and understand how much of that actually hits home in each of the islands. It was also good to see the different development partners and who's the most prominent, Australia and so forth. I thought the point that you made, Stacy-ann, about do we really know whether it's an adaptation project or whatnot. I think you'll find with a lot of projects, they have a lot of value adds across different sectors. So it is, when you're going to do an infrastructure project, it doesn't just solve one problem. It can solve a multitude of problems. So I think being in the Pacific and trying to access funding, there is a team to try and fit it to suit the various criteria or conditionalities you put around all of these fronts. With Samoa on the water, so we've just upgraded in the Cook Islands our water system, and the challenges coming on the user pays. A lot of discussion that is coming out on social media or otherwise is the same thing: why should we pay? Some of the solutions that are also coming out through those discussions is free to a certain point, and then charging beyond that. Also that there are utilities, instead of duplicating the administration, that can bring down the cost. Power utilities that already have customer service systems and so forth. But I think it's not water, but more the provision of the delivery system that needs to be focused on, rather than just the water concept, because we're getting caught in that at the moment.
So did you have a specific question?
No, these are just comments, if that's okay with you.
That's
Yeah,
fine.
but I encourage you to break down that regional and Oceania point in the graph. Thank you.
Any other questions for the panel? Mr. Campbell, please.
This was a great panel. I learned a great deal about development in the Pacific region. My question is for Susana, and it's about water. The conservative estimates are that by 2030, 2/3 of the people on Earth will be without potable drinking water, safe drinking water. And the story of depriving people of their water rights is a very old history. And it's more interesting when you look at it in terms of who is taking the water and who the indigenous people are who are victims of this. And it's even more interesting when we look at the resistance against water stealing or the deprivation of water rights. And I was wondering if you may have looked at the case of the Betzold Water Corporation and its experience in Cochabamba, Bolivia, and how the people resisted that privatization scheme.
One of our panel members can answer that, please.
So your question is, sorry, you were wondering if I was looking at the experience in Bolivia of the people. That's a very hard question. Why don't you ask easy questions? Anyway, I'll try to answer your question. To be honest, no. But I hope this will answer your question. The payment for the PES scheme is basically, I think, fits in the climate adaptation thing to do. This is what we've decided in the islands to do. Before we go to the donors and ask for funding, we need to demonstrate that we're actually doing something to help ourselves before we ask others to help us. Secondly, the biggest issue in terms of water conservation is to do with land tenure and land management. So until we solve that problem, I think then we can move in. What I propose is a universal water surcharge of 2%. But they say, you're nuts. You can't go to the people and say, pay up. So I think what we've done in the last 3 months or so is what my friend from the Cook Islands has said. There's a certain amount that if you overuse that amount, then the charges kick in. So that's where we are at the moment. But no, I did not look at the experience of the Bolivian. We only managed to look at people who produced success stories of how to implement a PES scheme. But we put out an ad for a technical advisor, a PES expert, of which EU will pay for the consultant to come and help us with our baby steps with our PES scheme.
Okay. I believe we're almost running out of time. I have one more question in the back. Mohammed Kumar. And please keep it short if you can, if at all possible.
Thank you. Just a couple of comments to ask the question of ADB. The one is that I thank you for the response in terms of the authoritative sources. I think what is important though is to appreciate that some of these reports are done for self-serving interests. So I think we need to be guided by that. In terms of the adaptation funding, which Mick sort of talked about, I think the GCF is committed to give about 50% of their funding for adaptation. And if that 100 billion is realized, that at least 50 billion will be coming for adaptation. So that's the good news. Now my question to ADB is, in response, in your presentation, you concentrated, of course, quite naturally on loans. One of the things SIDS are very irritated by is just getting loans to deal with disaster, building resilience due to climate impacts and things which are of no fault of theirs. ADB institution, which is already affiliated to GCF, why couldn't it assist countries in trying to get grants from GCF for things like insurance premiums, which you said, of course, quite rightly, very, very expensive. And insurance really would be one of the most effective resilience measures in terms of dealing with droughts and other climatic variables in the future, which will be exacerbated by climate change. Thank you.
A panel member for ADB.
So the concessional assistance countries receive mainly grants from us. So what I was talking about, they are grouped based on their debt sustainability, and countries with a high sustainability, high risk of debt distress, like Kiribati, Tuvalu, a lot of the others as well, receive 100% grant funding from ADB. And the other ones, like Tonga, Samoa, receive 50% grants and 50% concessional loans. So we are looking at substantial amounts of grants, actually, way more than loans. And even of the loans, they're concessional. So at a discount rate of 5%, we look at 50% grant element of that loan. So it's highly subsidized, mainly grants. But ADB also works with the GCF, and I think we have one project now for Fiji, where we help Fiji access GCF financing, where it became also clear that it's such like the paperwork quote there, that it's basically we won't be able to help all countries develop proposals for GCF financing because it requires so many resources. So that's why one of the ideas is here looking at possibly having a regional proposal that helps to channel GCF financing with less resources, or making GCF less resourced. I'm not fully familiar how the Fiji project was, but I think that it took several months of international staff time and so on to just develop all that paperwork. So in the long run, this wouldn't be, especially for smaller countries, it's basically impossible to comply. So yeah, we will look into that as part of this facility design, whether that could be something we could channel through there and help countries access more financing.
Thank you. I think that's all the questions we have for the time we have, according to my people here. So yes, thank you very much, panel members, and the talks were great. Thank you, give a round of applause.